greeted by someone as you enter a dark chamber. You cannot make out much, but you hear voices whispering as you approach. Suddenly, you're blindfolded and led toward the center of the room. How did you get here after all? Life here in Wallachia and the Danubian territories has been relatively quiet, but there is a certain restlessness in the air. As a member of the Phanariotes, your family does its part to govern the locals. You are part of the Greek community from Constantinople, sent by the Sublime Porte of the Ottoman Turks to administer the region. You do feel the slightest murmurings of unrest, the beginnings of some future ferment. Sometimes the locals turn against your rule as much as the Ottomans you serve. An attempted uprising was recently addressed, as a matter of fact. But you also know the struggles of your countrymen to the south in Hellas. Your friend had told you about a group that was trying to do some big things, although he did not quite fill you in on all the details. You've heard about other such societies growing around Europe and the rest of the world to further causes of independence, self-determination, free thinking, among the most famous being the Freemasons. Now, as you approach the inner chamber, you recall your friend mentioned something about an oath. You were made to kneel down and put your hand on a book. Told it is the Bible. Suddenly the blindfold comes off and you see hooded figures around with an icon of the Theotokos before you in dim candlelight. You can also make out emblems of the phoenix rising from the ashes. The priest charged with the duty of initiation approaches you and makes you swear an oath. I swear in the name of truth and justice before the Supreme Being to guard, by sacrificing my own life and suffering the hardest toils, the mystery which shall be explained to me, and that I shall respond with the truth, whatever I am asked. With your hand on the holy book, you are made to recite an oath to fight for the very independence of Greece itself. Even notable non-Greek leaders have joined, like Karageorge of Serbia, Tudor Vladimirescu of Wallachia, Alecu Filipescu, all swearing allegiance to a mysterious, invisible authority. But we are not to ask about this. The time has come to unite with your brothers across the Balkans and bring change at last. This will be no easy feat. The Turks still maintain a strong grip on the region, and it will be dangerous. You have your work cut out for you, but maybe, just maybe, with the ties forged in this secret society, you may yet have a chance.
Welcome back to another episode.
This is the Charlie and Andrei podcast, coming at you, talking about another historical topic. This time we're going to be talking about the Filiki Eteria, which is a Greek sort of society that helped fund and make possible the Greek War of Independence. It means the Society of Friends, sort of, and this all kind of happened in the early 19th century and was very instrumental toward a lot of movements there. It had some interesting links to other similar kind of movements around the world, including like Freemasonry and the Carbonari and all that stuff. And so we're going to get into all that and kind of the fascinating emergence of this group and, you know, its members and what it did. So,
Yeah, Filiki Eteria, it's a fascinating kind of secret society. I think you could literally call it a secret society,
yeah, yeah.
not necessarily Masonic, but it was like the translation is Filiki, which means like friendly. Eteria sometimes in modern Greek is like company, association, society, and I think it's this idea that there was like Greeks that were there's this Greek diaspora that existed all over different parts of Europe. And indeed, it was founded in Odessa, which is in modern day Ukraine. And a lot of these were like the leaders in these movements were either, no, noblemen of different parts of Europe or part of the Greek Phanerite in Constantinople. And what they were trying to do was kind of like coordinate this movement for Greek independence that was based around new identities of what it meant to be Greek, kind of merging the old Hellenic ideals and the Roman ideals of the Byzantine Empire that ultimately kind of fell apart in the 1400s, namely 1453, the fall of Constantinople. And a lot of this was done outside of the what modern day Greece and outside of the Ottoman Empire. So Odessa, they evidently had a headquarters in Constantinople as well. Um, and of course, there was a massive Greek population there at the time. And they modeled themselves after, Freemasonic types of entities. They had a secret initiation ritual that involved like an icon and a Greek Orthodox priest, and they had what's interesting, kind of this invisible authority, which is a fascinating concept in itself. There's not a lot of information of how it was structured, but they weren't cells. It was like we know who we are. There's a whole connection of us, and I swear that we're going to, part of their oath is to try to rebuild this Greek country, or reestablish the Greek state. And that was coming off kind of the coattails of the Napoleonic Revolution. It was founded in 1814, so 1815 is the last stand of Napoleon, and the Congress of Vienna that reconstituted Europe was in
Hmm.
1815 as well. And a lot of these leaders, like Alexander Ypsilantis, which I know Andrei is going to get into a little bit as well, they fought in the Napoleonic Wars. So a lot of these
Right.
people, even non Filiki Eteria leaders, were well versed in the wars of the Napoleonic era, which came after the coattails, of course, of the French Revolution, right? And
Yeah.
that's a whole nother revolution,
And
not
then
necessarily based. Yeah,
that after the American Revolution, so on and so forth. It's definitely a
yeah,
revolutionary era. A lot of stuff was going on.
right, right, right. So, I mean, what kind of initially got you interested in this, Andre, and like, where do you see it, like its main focus and primary interest in
Well,
from your perspective?
I mean, it's interesting because it highlights sort of like this network of Greeks throughout the Ottoman Empire at the time and throughout the Balkans and that part of the world, and how they were able to kind of organize together effectively to create, the beginnings of sort of a, you know, uprising of sorts. So it almost kind of reminds me a little bit of like, I don't know if you're watching this show, Andor. It's like a Star Wars show about the rise of the rebellion and its roots and its beginnings. A lot of like kind of secret associations and things like that. And it's kind of fascinating how these things like start up and eventually grow into something bigger and more, you know, powerful, something that actually has like teeth. Um,
It makes sense that these ideas would come up in any sort of civil, society, whether it's something like modeled off the Rotary Club or Masonic or a book club or a supper club. I mean, like any sort of club, people are going to get together and come up with new ideas. So it makes sense that they would be in this type of organization with an aim to do something, right?
right, of course. And this is, I mean, like I said, like you mentioned, they were somewhat influenced by other secret societies of the time. Freemasonry being one of them. They were kind of modeled somewhat after that. They were also influenced by the Carbonari, who had a similar structure, although those guys had kind of these distributed cells, and things like that throughout areas, which was not necessarily quite the case in this case. But and then of course in the late 1700s, there's also the Illuminati, like the literal Illuminati, which was like a Bavarian group. So it was kind of an era in which a lot of these, Enlightenment ideas were kind of fomenting and actual revolutions were happening. There were idealist interests, there were more practical interests, and they all kind of came together in ways that upturned like this kind of old world order in some ways, although it took a while in various cases. Um, in the case of this group, particularly interesting to me because like a lot of its origins were among Greeks that were connected to the Danubian principalities, where I'm originally from. So like Wallachia, Moldavia. So Ypsilantis, well, he wasn't the original founder. There were originally several other guys, but he was asked to become one of the leaders of it in the later 1810s, and he served in the Russian military, I think, actually in the Napoleonic Wars, and then he later kind of joined this group. What's interesting is that his mother was actually Romanian. Was Her name was Elisabeta Văcărescu. Uh, so it's kind of part of the nobility there, and what's it called? Ypsilantis actually. So he, I guess we're kind of skipping ahead a little bit to 1821 and the actual start of the uprisings that would, kick this all off. But like they're so before the uprising in Bucharest that actually kind of kicked off the Greek Revolution, there was another sort of like attempted uprising rebellion by this guy George Vladimirescu, who was a Romanian or Wallachian guy. He led this group called the Pandurs. They were a military kind of group that, interestingly, it was not an anti-Ottoman uprising, although you might think that's what it was. It was actually more of an anti-Phanariote uprising. The Phanariotes were a group of Greek rulers from the Phanar district of Constantinople that were sent by the Ottomans to kind of govern the Danubian principalities. And they had kind of a mixed record. In some ways, like I mean, some people liked them, some people didn't. They did kind of garner some degree of resentment after a while. So this was kind of an uprising that was against their rule. And it had some moderate success. But interestingly, even though they and the Filiki Eteria were somewhat aligned at first, eventually the Eteria kind of infiltrated and then like sort of um, compromised their goal in some ways, and eventually the rebellion failed in part because it was against these kind of Greek noble interests in Wallachia. Um, so that yeah, that was interesting. And then later that year, Ypsilantis also launched this uprising in Bucharest and was hoping that all the Balkans and like the Christian Romanians there, the Wallachians would like join in and participate, but that wasn't really the case. In fact, a lot of the local Wallachian authorities decided not to really help out because they wanted to play it cool and were kind of worried about an Ottoman backlash. So that was sort of a powder keg for it, though, and eventually, even though that rebellion was crushed at Dragașani, I think the following year, uprisings began in the Peloponnese, and then kind of they snowballed there and kind of gained more support from Western powers and things like that over time. As we know, like famously, like various French and British, like Lord Byron, they volunteered in that war. So, the rest was history. And I guess we can actually have a different podcast covering the actual Greek Revolution. But this is kind of like how this group of mostly Greek expats throughout like the sort of Black Sea, Danubian, and Russian region created this organization to start this uprising. and then there were several others. I think uh, a member of the Mavrocordates family, which is another big uh, was it? I think it was what a Wallachian. I just want to verify that.
Yeah, he was definitely I mean he was one of the big statesmen and like if you read about the Greek Revolution, he wasn't exactly a fighter, but he was more of a political figure and he was like more of like the administrative and constitutional and legal aspects of the Greek Revolution and um organizing the early Greek state. So and he was definitely he was related at least to the royalty of like in Wallachia or
That's
the
right. Yeah,
nobility
yeah.
of
Because that was a family. The Mavrocordatos family goes back like several hundred years. I mean, they're originally from Chios, but they're Fifinariots
right.
that ruled there for a while, and he was related to the Karaja family. It was another influential one. Um, Later,
And
he
actually
apparently lived in Pisa with Percy
yes,
by Shelley, apparently, and his wife Mary Shelley, interestingly. But that's a whole nother part
the
of his
author
life.
of Frankenstein, the modern
Yep, yep.
Prometheus, indeed.
And
Yeah.
furthermore, you had the Prince of Moldavia, Michael Soutsos. He was of Greek Phonaria origin. He also joined the Filiki Eteria, which is interesting. Um, so there is several forces there that are all kind of. Apparently, there was also, interestingly, some of the Arnaut Albanians that actually joined the Romanian cause against the Greek Phaneria rule earlier, what I'm seeing. But
What's sort of like contradictory in my mind, or something you wouldn't necessarily expect, is that the Wallachian uprising that you were talking about that occurred in 1821 seems to have been just unexpected and maybe not the best planned activity,
right,
but it happened completely outside of like what we would even consider Greece, even at that time, or,
right, right, right.
And but it's interesting that this, in modern day Romania, on the Olt River, right? They're crossing the river and into like invade Ottoman troops, and then you have like three groups of belligerents, right? You have like the Ottomans, the Greek revolutionaries, and like the Wallachians, you said, who wanted to be kind of standoffish about this, and that makes sense given their kind of economic interest for sure.
Yeah,
Uh, and that it's interesting that it happened almost hundreds of miles away from like where the major part of the revolution would be occurring in the Peloponnesus, sorry. And I mean, I find that fascinating, but it goes to show that the Filiki Eteria was all over the place.
right.
Um, yeah,
I mean, yeah, it was kind of decentralized in some ways, but I mean, there was actually a substantial amount of Greek settlers in Wallachia and the Danubian principalities, particularly in the urban areas. Of course, I part of my own family kind of goes back to that, but yeah, yeah, it's interesting that I guess they kept in touch, and they had a network among themselves, and it kind of worked out. They're able to gather resources and spread the word, and there were significant um,
I mean,
forces.
it makes sense economically speaking
Yeah,
that like Greeks would stay in contact with other Greeks. They were merchants. They were involved in economic trade throughout the Ottoman Empire and bordering areas such as the Russian Empire
yeah,
and Italy and things of that nature. And I guess you bring up also a good point that it's not necessarily they had a consolidated movement like all the Christians were anti-Ottoman. Well, no, there were some like who were pro-Phanerite, some were not against or were against the Phanerite because they saw them as working in cahoots with the Ottoman authorities and
yeah,
things
or
like
generally kind of being exploitative, to like the peasant or the average, person there. Yeah,
that. And it's interesting to think about that in the background. Well, the French Revolution wasn't really nationalist, even though it kind of was based around nationality. But Napoleon wanted to spread it to reorganized like the Confederation of the Rhine and everything into German territories, and like a lot of countries started adopting the notions of the French Revolution, even in like the Netherlands or Haiti and things like that. But in Greece, it was very clearly like a nationalist agenda in its very nascent forms, like around this time of Romanticism. So you're kind of because there was like the Enlightenment period, right? That definitely leads to the American and the French revolutions. But then you kind of have like the Enlightenment in Europe, and also the Enlightenment, the modern Greek Enlightenment, and that leads to the Greek national movement. And this is kind of the basis for nationalism as it's grown since the early 1800s.
Right? Yeah, this was like I think as we discussed like another podcast, this is one of the first kind
Right.
of ethno-nationalist revolutions, that
Mhm.
that kind of helped push this idea of national determinism and independence and later the idea of irredentism and things like that. So obviously it spread to other areas. Um, Famously in the 19th century, you had like the Italian unification, the German unification. Later on, Romania, like the Danubian principalities, Wallachia and Moldavia, they gained independence kind of gradually, like in the 18, actually in 1848, that was the year of revolutions. There was a big uprising in Wallachia among the elite and intellectuals there, partly inspired by the events in France and other places like that. And then, they kind of loosened up in the 1850s and 60s and gained more independence. And by 1877, they were able to actually kick the Ottomans out, partly with the help of the Russians, which ended up kind of backfiring as because then the Russians saw an opportunity to kind of come into the region and try to exert influence, which has opened up a whole another can of worms that we're still kind of dealing with to this day in some ways, but
Right,
that's
right.
another topic. But yeah, so then that other Balkan countries in the late 1800s and the turn of the century, like Serbia and Bulgaria and whatnot, Albania, yeah. So like all these countries, oh, and of course, as we talked about famously, like the Bosnians, the Czechs, the Slovaks in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, kind of kicking off this powder keg of World War One. We talked about the Balkan Wars and things like that. So this kind of was like, in some ways, the origin of that like thread that like started. So
Right,
it's,
right, right. Yeah, and it definitely relates to our podcast, certainly about the Balkan Wars, which would be coming up 90 years later.
yeah,
Uh,
exactly, exactly.
yeah, yeah. But I know we're kind of getting a little bit off the topic that we initially intended. We're definitely going to do a podcast on the Greek Revolution itself. But we wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of like the ritual per se of
Oh yeah, yeah. Sure,
Filiki
sure.
Eteria. And it's interesting because it's very much inspired by like Greek Orthodoxy, and Orthodox icons are like I think mandatory for or were mandatory for the Filiki Eteria, and potentially a Bible or some other sacred text. And basically you would be as a candidate, you would be brought into like kind of this darkened rooms, and there's like swords and icons and sometimes like maybe veiled faces or something like that. And it's kind of like a mystical thing going on. But you're brought in there to to kind of create a covenant between God and your country and yourself. So it's kind of like that little triumvirate. And basically, how it starts is you have two bondsmen, synedismi, basically two sponsors. They bring you into the room, and then there's like a table in the center of the room, and it's like a Bible or some Orthodox icons, and maybe some Greek flags are adorning this table. And like in that preparatory phase, you're there. They tell him, or they tell this potential, I guess, brother, so to speak, like what the society's aims are, and like the goal is the liberation of the Greek people. And then there's like this silence, apparently, right? This is what writers have written afterwards. And then he's bound to an oath never to reveal what he sees or hears here, pain of death, blah, 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 all that stuff, covenant with God. And then he kind of has this like catechism, which is kind of questions and answers about his faith and his patriotism and his willingness to sacrifice his entire life, very much in line with kind of the Constitution of the Declaration of Independence. The last lines are that they pledge their life, liberties, and sacred honors. So likewise, they're pledging their life, or their property, and their sacred honor. And unlike Freemasonry, there's no Grand Lodge or something like that in sort of an overarching authority, but they swore kind of authority to invisible authorities, and that's the myth. That's kind of the mythological context in this, that they swore an authority to like the invisible authority. And it's not like necessarily an invisible pope or something. It's like, and I think it's interesting because I think they must have had some cognitive dissonance in saying like, okay, we're it's not God, it's not like a religious thing. It's just like an invisible authority, and it's not like a cells or something. They just know like it's almost like you believe it, but you know it's not true, type of thing. And I think that is kind of cool, almost anthropologically and psychologically, to acknowledge. Even though maybe they didn't think about it, they had other things on their mind. And then right after that, they're like, well, now our real purpose is the lights come on, and like the real purpose of the society is to overthrow Ottoman rule where Greeks live, and they take a final oath of fidelity, and you can read these oaths like online, about and they're very similar to Carbonari oaths insofar as I understand as well. It's like may I be struck down by lightning or something. I am going to support this cause for the rest of my life, and then
Oh
it
yeah, and that
becomes.
and Freemasonry in some ways too.
Yeah, sure. And then you become, of course, they wouldn't be doing this in English. They'd be doing it in Greek, and it's like Adelphos, like Adelphi, like
Yeah,
Philadelphia, like brotherly love.
brother,
And then,
yeah, other
and
folks.
then you get like the signs and the passwords and the grips and whatever, all that jazz. So anyway, that's just kind of a little snippet of what the Filiki Eteria was doing as a
So I guess what you
ritual.
mean by like this invisible is like basically a higher cause, right? A higher power, something that
Yes.
transcends like into individual and petty aims, like like they're actually aiming for, you know, some ideal, I guess. Yeah. So, which,
Well, I mean, I would say like anthropologically, it's kind of interesting. Just like there's this omnipresent higher council that exists, and it's not God, and they know it's not God, and they're not saying that it's necessarily supernatural, uh, but it's like you sacrifice the logic maybe in your mind to acknowledge that this exists. And
uh,
I mean, I think you
interesting.
could see that with, kind of collective representations of society itself, as anthropologists maybe have discovered in like Papua New Guinea or studying Polynesian tribes or something. And it's kind of just like it's just a mask that you put over yourself as an initiate. And I guess it's what Emil Durkheim would call like a totem. It's like the
Oh
the
yeah,
truth of
Emil, I remember.
it,
Yeah, I studied
yeah,
some.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like the truth of and the unity of the group is embodied, and it's hidden and made sacred because they know it's not real, or they may not know it's not real. Like they may really like have a conscious conversation with themselves or other people, uh, but it's like a belief that these participants are given, like that extends beyond themselves. It's like providence with a capital P, um, and that can function to like legitimate power. It can like enforce moral discipline. And some, there's another term that Emil Durkheim has, which is collective efflorescence, that in any
Oh yeah.
initiatory type of
Uh,
experience, there's this moment when like authority, like big capital letters authority is revealed, and you're charged with like this fear and awe. And I mean, even in like almost simplistic, almost silly terms, that's like seeing the Wizard of Oz. Like not seeing the guy behind the curtain, but seeing like the wizard himself with all the smoke screen and everything. And you get this emotional surge, right? That I think even Native American tribes would have had similar experiences. Or
there
you
you
have like
go,
these totemic rituals in Australia and things like that.
connecting it to
So
another podcast of ours.
indeed, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
but that's just some background on because ultimately a lot of the stuff that we're interested in is related, right? I mean, we're talking about nationalism, we're talking about maybe the psychological, anthropological basis of nationalism. How do like secret societies as meeting places function? Um,
And Rome, a lot of Rome. Don't forget
a
that.
lot of Rome, well, and of course Rome is related to this
Rome.
podcast because the popular. I mean, a lot of these people would have called themselves Rum, R-U-M.
Yeah, it's interesting. So like the Greeks even of the early 1800s still had that identity of room as opposed. I mean, obviously, yeah, Hellenes was sort of classical and you know almost had a pagan connotation during the Byzantine Empire. But I think by that point though, there was some degree of like Hellenic identity being explored, right? Like it wasn't like maybe as explicit
Yes.
as it would be later, but it wasn't seen as like, almost in a during the Byzantine era it was almost like negative. It was like pagan and it's like no, we're Christian now. We're Room.
Yeah, and I mean the Balkans for large part was called a province of Romelia under the
Right.
Ottoman authorities, and they saw them, I think, as Romans, in some sense. And I think that, yeah, you're right. I mean, there was this new resurgence in what they called like the modern Greek Enlightenment that was kind of leading to this. That was kind of picking off of the Enlightenment. You had like a lot of these thinkers who were in the Filiki Eteria, right? Like a lot of the people ultimately were like constitutional writers and working on the Greek Republic or kingdom as such, as it came about. I don't know if Ioannis Kapodistrias was
Oh yeah.
uh,
This was-
Filiki Eteria, but he was like the first governor
Yeah,
of Greece.
not sure.
But
He
I think he was
was.
certainly in contact with them.
Yeah,
Uh,
I
yeah,
believe
yeah, and
so.
yeah, yeah.
Well,
And
Kolokotronis was
oh,
definitely a
big time,
member.
big time, yes,
He was a clef. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And I mean, the Clefs were basically mountain people who lived out there.
Right.
The Amatoloi were just basically like Christian militias fighting. But I wouldn't. I would say like Clefs and Amartaloi were different than like Filkieteria because the Filkieteria like the Clefs. I mean, for lack of a better thing, I mean they're not like intellectuals based in, kind of cosmopolitan commerce and things like that. I don't think they're taking oaths in
Well, no, I don't think they're
rooms. Yeah. I mean,
more
he's
martial, but kind of rural people. Yeah, they're not like part of the
right.
intellectual. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Um, but you were talking about
mhm.
Colocotrones?
Well, yeah, it was just no, just how because he was obviously a central figure and leader in the War of Independence, but and he was a member of this, but uh, yeah, I'm not sure how deep his involvement actually was.
In Filiki. Well, I mean, he
Yeah,
was a major figure in terms of fighting and combat. I mean, he was like one of
right,
the main generals,
right,
and he
right, exactly.
interacted with Lord Byron again, who was friends with Mavro Michalis, Alexander's, or no, no, not Mavro, Kordatos, um,
Yeah,
who was he was more of the constitutional guy, and he was at the University of Padua, and he was one of the big Phaneria Greeks, who, like you said, was roommates with Percy Bysshe Shelley and Mary
yeah,
Shelley, who are major literary figures. Um,
interesting.
yeah, but I think like if you took a step back and like said, okay, what do all these like invisible societies, sort of, or maybe not invisible, but like hidden societies kind of have in common, like an Ur society. I mean, they're just basically meeting places, whether, whether it's Freemasonry or whether it's Filiki or the Rotary Club or, any type of association. It's just a place for members of similar interests to meet. Um, And I mean, it kind of goes to that famous Adam Smith quote from Wealth of Nations, which was published a little bit before the founding of Filiki Eteria, but in his book published in 1776, of all years, he says, "People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation always ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices." So, I mean, he's talking more in economic terms, but the idea stands that, okay, yeah, people get together for some agenda, usually.
Yeah. So
Um,
sometimes they're up to no
yeah.
good.
And I think
Sometimes
that's
they're-
the same thing with like any type of society in this context.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, what else is I was gonna say something else related to that, but
I mean,
yeah.
we were talking about like the Filiki Eteria and things like that, and the
Oh,
friendly
well, yeah,
organization.
I know that. We covered most of what they, I mean, one more thing that they did interestingly was Ypsilantis created this thing called the Sacred Band. It was just, he borrowed for the name from the Sacred Band of Thebes, apparently. It was created in Fokshan in Wallachia, but this was sort of like a yeah, like volunteers, students and stuff from these places. Uh, so it's like almost like a sort of youth group or of young people that could become the soul of his army over time. And interesting
Right.
ideas I kind of borrowed from the classical era, but adapted them to this kind of modern romanticist revolutionary era. Um,
Absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
speaking of youth groups, yeah, you've heard of a HEPA, right? Like that's another
Yes.
modern.
Yeah. I'm in a HEPA. I think that, I mean, certainly there was no continuity between a HEPA and, or I mean, Filiki Eteria, because Filiki Eteria, I mean, its main goal was basically just to found the Greek Republic and once it was founded, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, I've read nothing on the internet that has any indication that it exists in any form. But yeah, HEPA is like American Educational or American Hellenic Educational and Progressive Association. And that was founded like over 100 years later in
In like
1922.
1920 something, yeah, yeah, right around the time of
Yeah.
Ottoman
It has its
breakup. Yeah.
HQ in DC. And I mean, it's a good organization. I mean, I would say that it is just oriented towards helping Greeks assimilate to the United States, and it's kind of like a nice fraternal organization. I would say from what I've read, I mean, it just completely different. I doubt even the founders of it had Filiki Eteria on their mind. But I think it goes back to that Adam Smith quote that, if people are coming together, there's a reason they're coming together. And there's a reason a Hitler comes together. There's a reason, Filiki Eteria, any group of individuals comes together, whether it's like the American Anthropological Association or something. I mean, uh, there's a reason groups form. I mean, we could even get like to the why do cities form? Like
Well,
that's another
yeah, yeah, I know, but like,
why do downtowns exist at
yeah,
all, right? Why do
but
central business districts
in some
exist?
in some cases, the reason they form is partly just due to social, the need to socialize and to
Oh
stay
yeah.
current. That's sometimes overlooked, like there's not always some grand, purpose or plan. Like
Right.
a lot of modern, quote unquote, secret societies and stuff like that, like they're not so secret. And a lot of people just kind of go there to hang out with their friends and share for fraternity, brotherhood and
I would say the same thing about like Greek Orthodox churches in the US. I mean, I would say they're slightly different from Protestant churches in some sense because they're almost like community centers. Like at Greek Orthodox churches, you can learn how to speak Greek, you can learn to dance, you learn to cook. It's kind of a community center to meet with people. And like in Greece, you would have that, you could go like, oh, this is where you go learn how to do Greek dance. This is where you learn how to cook at home, that
Yeah,
type of thing.
exactly. Yep.
So,
Exchange of information, ideas. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I imagine that similar exchanges occurred in Filiki Eteria too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But it seems like we're coming on time, right?
I think we are, yeah.
No.
So, yeah, that about wraps this one up, ladies and gents.
It gets us ready for the Greek Revolution one coming
Yeah,
up.
which, at some point, hopefully in maybe this year, maybe in a couple of years, who knows when we'll actually get to it, but because
We have
we
delays
tend to
sometimes.
bounce around a lot if you haven't noticed, but you know, we'll get there. And anyway, we hope you enjoyed this discussion of this fascinating group. And yeah, if you're interested at all, just comment. Also, if you have any questions, and stay tuned for the next one. So,
All right.
thank you.
Like, comment, subscribe. Thank you.